There are certain truths that time does not erase. It only buries them, layer upon layer, beneath the accumulated weight of fear and forgetting. And there are certain figures who move through the centuries not as men, but as shadows cast by a flame that never fully went out. Figures the world could never quite name with precision, and who, for that very reason, received whatever names were left: heretic, sorcerer, accursed. Names that say more about those who spoke them than about those who bore them. At the center of this story, raised upon the most sacred throne in Christendom, stands a man who knew too much. A man whose knowledge arrived too early, in a world still learning to walk through the shadows of ignorance. His intelligence was unsettling, his vision incomprehensible. And when what cannot be understood rises to power, the world finds only one explanation for the inexplicable: the pact with the devil. This is the mystery of Sylvester II, the Pope whom some called wise and others called possessed. The man who reached the stars with his hands and was, for that very reason, accused of touching hell with his soul. A story that walks the border between the sacred and the profane, between history and legend, between what can be proven and what can only be felt. The corridors of the Vatican guard many secrets, yellowed manuscripts that have never been opened to the eyes of the world, chambers sealed for centuries, names that appear in records and that just below carry annotations written in darker ink, as if someone had returned afterward and added what had not been said the first time. Among all those secrets, this Pope's name reverberates with a singular weight, as if the very air around the words carries a different temperature. If this mystery has already touched something in you, an intuition, a premonition, that strange feeling that there is more beyond what the eyes can reach, stay. There is something here you need to hear. Not because it is comfortable, but because forgotten truths tend to return with an insistence that silence cannot contain. What makes this story different from all others is not simply its antiquity, nor the grandeur of the office its protagonist held. What makes it different is the question it carries within itself, silent as a knife inside sacred robes. What if knowledge, in and of itself, were capable of condemning a man? What if intelligence, in an age of darkness, were indistinguishable from magic? What if the devil in certain eras did not dwell in the shadows but in books? The narrative that now opens does not promise definitive answers. It promises something harder and more valuable: contact with a genuine mystery, with a life that defied the limits of the possible and was, for that reason, wrapped in myth. Whoever follows this journey will not emerge from it unchanged, carrying a doubt, a suspicion, or perhaps a flash of recognition, because what was forgotten still calls to us. And sometimes, that call comes from within a story 1,000 years old. To understand the legend, one must first pass through the veil of history. And history begins in a humble place, not among the marble columns of the church, not among the golden candles of the altars, but in a small village in the interior of a land that still breathed beneath the weight of centuries of obscurantism. There, in an age when most men were born, lived and died without ever questioning the limits of what was known, a different child was born. The world that received him was a world of ritualized darkness. Faith was the only permitted light, and any other flame was suspect. Astronomy was constrained by dogma. Mathematics was treated as a dangerous curiosity. And philosophy, whenever it dared to venture beyond the scriptures, was quickly smothered by the collective fear of questioning what was not meant to be questioned. In that landscape, a boy began asking questions the others never asked. He began seeing patterns where others saw only the chaos of nature. He began seeking answers in sources the others did not even know existed. This young man's journey took him beyond the frontiers of the world he knew, toward lands where knowledge still breathed, where the inheritance of ancient civilizations had survived in the form of manuscripts, instruments, and techniques that Europe had forgotten or never come to know. He studied astronomy from treatises that described the movement of the planets with unsettling precision. He absorbed the logic of numerical systems that would, centuries later, transform all of Western mathematics. He learned to operate the abacus with a dexterity that made those who watched him hesitate between admiration and dread. When he returned to the world he had left, he was a different man, or at least so it seemed, because what he had learned surpassed, in a disconcerting way, everything his contemporaries were capable of understanding. And that which cannot be understood, in an age when the incomprehensible belonged to the realm of the supernatural, inevitably finds its way to accusation. The first rumors began as they always do, softly, almost inaudibly, sliding through the corridors like morning fog. They said he knew too much, that his memory was supernatural, that he calculated with a speed impossible for an ordinary human being, that his predictions about the stars came true with a precision that could only come from a source that was not human. The fear people felt was not the fear of ignorance. It was something more sophisticated, and for that reason, more dangerous. It was the fear of those who recognize on some level that they stand before something they cannot explain. And when the inexplicable dresses itself in the clothes of power, when the incomprehensible sits upon the most sacred throne in Christendom, that fear takes on the forms that history records as legend. The story of this man's rise to the papacy is, in itself, extraordinary. It was not a straightforward path, not a linear trajectory. It was a climb marked by disputes, strategic alliances, and a political intelligence that matched his intellectual brilliance in an almost disconcerting way, as if the same mind that had unlocked the secrets of the stars were equally capable of deciphering the secrets of the human heart. And there, at the center of the greatest spiritual power in the Western world, he carried with him everything he had learned in distant lands, his instruments, his manuscripts, his methods. He introduced to the world around him what were, to him, simple tools of thought. But to those who observed him, those tools carried a strange scent, the scent of something that did not come from God. Each layer that is revealed brings another shadow. The veil has not yet fully lifted, and what comes next is denser, darker, and closer to the heart of the mystery. Every legend has a seed, a first truth, small and real, that time transforms, amplifies, distorts, until the original seed can barely be recognized beneath the forest that has grown around it. The legend of the pact with the devil was not born from nothing. It was born from something that was true, and that was progressively wrapped in the garments of myth by men who needed an explanation for what they could not understand. The medieval chronicles that record this pope's life are fascinating precisely because they reveal more about the minds of those who wrote them than about the life of the one they describe. Every account of a wonder, every description of supernatural ability, every veiled accusation can be traced to a specific source: astonishment. The astonishment of men who looked upon someone who knew more than they did, who thought differently from them, who used tools and concepts beyond their comprehension, and who had no other language available but the language of the supernatural to name what they saw. There are records that describe, in unsettling detail, the creation of an artifact, a head built from metal and arcane wisdom, capable of answering questions with only two sounds: yes or no. There was no room, in that time, for any understanding of automata or mechanisms. There was no vocabulary to describe an object that functioned according to principles that science would take centuries to systematize. And so, what may have been a philosophical instrument or a logic experiment was recorded as something that could only have existed with the help of forces that were not human. Other fragments describe the supposed apprenticeship in forbidden lands, lands where the knowledge of ancient civilizations had flourished while Europe plunged into the darkness of the Iron Centuries. They describe a young man who had learned not only mathematics and astronomy, but deeper secrets, arts that had no name among the men of the church, techniques that came from traditions predating Christianity itself, and which, for that very reason, were regarded with eyes of suspicion. There is something unsettling about the consistency of these accusations. They repeat themselves, varying in detail, but converging on one central point. This man knew things he should not have known, and the way he had obtained that knowledge was, to the mindset of the age, inseparable from the occult. Share what your instinct feels upon hearing this. Is it faith in the power of human knowledge? Or is it fear of what that knowledge might reveal? The deepest answers tend to come from silence, from that moment when the mind stops arguing and the body simply feels the weight of what is being said. Because what these medieval testimonies reveal, when read with care, is something more complex than a simple accusation of witchcraft. They reveal the exact moment when an entire civilization came face to face with the limits of its own understanding, and, frightened by what it saw beyond those limits, retreated to the only explanation that offered it safety. If it was incomprehensible, it was supernatural. If it was supernatural and did not come from God, it came from his opposite. The figure of this pope, wrapped in these accusations, carries a quiet tragedy that transcends the specific case itself. It is the tragedy of all those who arrived too early, who inhabited a future the present was not yet ready to recognize, and who were, for that reason, reduced to something simpler, more threatening, more easily understood. The mystery that forms around him is not merely the mystery of a man. It is the mystery of how knowledge can become heresy when it crosses the frontier of the comprehensible. It is the mystery of how light, when it burns too bright, can look like fire. If truth touches something invisible in you, leave a sign of light, a quiet gesture but a powerful one. Because that is how silence becomes community and mystery becomes shared. What comes next plunges still deeper into the invisible conflict this man waged not only against the world, but against himself. There is a war that is not waged with swords, that leaves no visible battlefields, no stone monuments to mark its dead. It is the war that takes place within the invisible space between what a man knows and what the world around him is willing to accept. It is the war of genius against the age that received it without being ready for it. And among all the forms that war can take, none is more devastating than the one in which the very battlefield is the warrior's own soul. This pope carried upon his shoulders the double weight of power and suspicion. On one side, the grandeur of the office, the voice that was meant to guide the spiritual conscience of an entire world, the ring that sealed the most sacred documents in Christendom, the chair from which decisions were made with reverberations lasting centuries. On the other, the constant, persistent, inescapable murmur, the silent accusation that circulated through the corridors like an odor that no one could identify precisely, but that everyone sensed. What this conflict reveals is not weakness, but a specific form of solitude. The solitude of one who inhabits a level of understanding that cannot be shared without arousing fear. The solitude of one who sees connections where others see only chaos, who perceives patterns where others see only the opaque surface of things. It is not the solitude of rejection. It is something subtler and more painful. It is the solitude of recognition that never fully arrives. The conflicts that surrounded this man's papacy were not merely political or theological. They were visible reflections of an invisible tension that ran through his entire existence. There were those who admired him with an admiration that carried beneath the surface some measure of dread. There were those who hated him with a hatred that, examined closely, revealed envy mixed with incomprehension. And there was a third category, perhaps the most unsettling. Those who simply did not know what to feel, who were suspended between devotion and distrust, unable to decide which side they belonged to. The legend of the pact with the devil, in this context, takes on a different dimension. It is not merely an outward accusation hurled by enemies. It is also the mirror of an internal conflict that any human being capable of deep reflection recognizes. The conflict between the desire to know and the fear of what knowing reveals. Between the ambition to understand the universe in its entirety and the premonition that such understanding carries a cost. Between the light of knowledge and the shadows that same light casts. Whether there was within this man some awareness of that dilemma, whether he understood on some level that his extraordinary capacity was at once his gift and his condemnation, that awareness does not appear in the historical record with any clarity. What appears are fragments, hints, suggestions of a complex psychology, inhabiting a time that lacked the tools to recognize it. Those who remain this far carry the weight of revelation, and the question that weight invites is a genuine one. Which side of the veil would you choose? The comfort of a belief that frames the incomprehensible within familiar categories, genius or demon, saint or accursed, or the discomfort of the space in between, which simply admits that certain questions have no definitive answer. Because what this chapter of history suggests is that perhaps the greatest pact this man ever made was not with the devil. It was with knowledge itself, that kind of silent agreement that everyone who decides to dedicate their life to understanding things enters into, without ceremony and without witnesses, in a moment of absolute clarity. The agreement that there will always be a price, that knowing isolates as much as it illuminates, that surpassing the limits of the accepted means inevitably living beyond the frontier of the protected, and in that age living beyond that frontier had consequences that time did not soften. It only transformed them into myth. Subscribe and walk with us, because every new video is a key, and every key opens another seal. What comes now is the apex of this journey, the point where the sacred and the shadowy touch each other with a precision that leaves the observer breathless. There is a moment in every mystery narrative, a singular instant, when the layers that have been carefully accumulated throughout the story suddenly converge upon a single point of pressure. A moment when the air grows denser, when the silence between words takes on its own texture, when the viewer realizes, without anything needing to be said explicitly, that they stand before something that transcends a simple reconstruction of facts. That moment in this story is the death of Sylvester II. The legend describes this pope's end with an unsettling precision, and at the same time, with the ambiguity characteristic of all that belongs to the realm of myth. Some versions speak of premonitions, that specific feeling, known to all who have ever stood before the irrevocable, that something is about to change in a final and irreversible way. A man is described who, in the days before the end, had retreated into a silence different from his usual silence. A silence that was not contemplative, it was heavy, laden with something those around him could not name but felt clearly on their skin. The oldest narratives speak of signs, the kind of signs that medieval men knew how to recognize with a sensitivity the modern world, for all its technical sophistication, lost somewhere along the way. The capacity to perceive that the universe communicates, that visible things are sometimes only the surface of messages coming from a deeper layer. A flame that flickered when there was no wind, an instrument that sounded when no hand touched it. A dream that was not a dream, but something more solid, more urgent. According to the legend most densely built around this death, the Pact had established a deadline, and that deadline was drawing to a close. The narrative that circulated through monasteries and ecclesiastical chambers in the centuries that followed describes a man who, in his final moments, sought some way to reverse the irreversible, who had attempted, with the same meticulous and analytical spirit that had characterized his entire intellectual life, to find a way out within the logic of an agreement he himself had made, or that, at least, they said he had made. But agreements of that kind, in the language of legends, have no loopholes. The force that acts in stories of pacts is not a force that negotiates, it is a force that fulfills. And so, regardless of what this man may have attempted in his final moments, the end came with the inexorability that all legends reserve for their moments of resolution. What makes this narrative extraordinary is not the description of the end itself. It is the silence that settled afterward. The silence of those who remained, who did not know exactly what had happened, but who felt, collectively, that something had closed in a way that was not simply the death of an old man in the exercise of his office. There was something more, a specific weight, an absence that had its own density, as if the physical space he had inhabited had been somehow emptier than the physical space of any other absence. The funeral rites were performed with the solemnity befitting the office. The prayers were spoken, the incense burned, and the chants rose. But there are records, fragments, footnotes in the official history that suggest not everyone present was certain exactly what they were burying. Whether it was a spiritual leader, whether it was a wise man, whether it was something that the available vocabulary could not adequately describe. If you have made it this far, you are already part of this rite. The simple act of watching is to participate, and what you are participating in is something that does not belong only to the past. It belongs to that part of the present that still holds unanswered questions, that still encounters mystery and, rather than retreating, takes a step forward. Leave your mark in the comments. That is how silence becomes community. That is how stories 1,000 years old find a new voice in new times. Because the mystery of Sylvester II did not die with him. Mystery, by definition, does not die. It only waits. And what awaits in the conclusion of this journey is something that even silence struggles to contain. Every mystery narrative holds, in its deepest interior, a question that is never asked directly. A question that moves along the edges of the words, that can be felt but not easily articulated, and that, when finally touched, reveals not an answer, but something more valuable, the true territory of the enigma. The question that circulates around Sylvester II is not, ultimately, whether or not he made a pact with the devil. That question, however much it has fueled centuries of speculation, is the surface question, the question that fear invented in order to give a name to what it could not name. The deeper question, the one that survives when all others have been set aside, is another. What happens to a civilization when it cannot receive its own geniuses? When the intelligence that ought to illuminate it terrifies it to the point of forcing it to build demonologies to explain what it simply does not understand? Throughout history, this was not a unique trajectory. The fate of being transformed into a monster or a myth for knowing too much, for seeing beyond the limits the collective had established as safe. That fate has repeated itself with unsettling regularity. As if there were a pattern inscribed not in the stars this Pope studied so intently, but in the human heart itself. The pattern of fearing what one does not understand, and of transforming that fear into narrative. The figure of Sylvester II, seen through this lens, ceases to be merely the figure of a man accused of occult practices and becomes something broader, a symbol. The symbol of every time knowledge has been treated as heresy, of every time curiosity has been criminalized, of every time surpassing the frontier of the accepted has meant being cast out of the world of those who belong to the flock and thrown into the world of those who belong to the other side, whatever that other side may be. But there is a still more unsettling layer to this reflection, and it concerns not the past but the present, because the impulse that transformed a brilliant scholar into an accursed pope does not belong only to the Middle Ages. It was not locked away inside dusty monasteries with the ink of medieval chronicles. That impulse is contemporary. It has simply changed its vocabulary. The words have shifted. No one speaks of a pact with the devil anymore, but the mechanisms are the same. Suspicion toward what one does not understand. The desire to find an explanation that draws the threatening back within the limits of the familiar. The need for the extraordinary to have an origin that is, in some way, manageable. And perhaps that is the most hidden revelation this story carries. Not the secret of a specific man, not the detail of some supposed pact made somewhere between the earth and the invisible, but the secret of a humanity that still today, centuries later, fears in ways that have not changed as much as it would like to believe. That still today transforms into a monster what it cannot categorize. That still today prefers the fantasy of the shadowy agreement to the more disconcerting and more human possibility. That sometimes, simply, some people know more. The true secret of Sylvester II is not buried with him. It is alive, in the accounts that continue to be told, in the questions that continue to be asked, in the persistence of a legend that has withstood 1,000 years of growing rationalism. It lives in the moments when, faced with the inexplicable, any person hesitates between the logical explanation and something older, more visceral, more immediate. It lives on the border between what we know and what we feel. And it is there, precisely there, that the pact with the devil truly exists. Not as a historical event, but as an eternal metaphor for the price of knowledge. For all that is lost when one decides to know, rather than simply to believe. The journey continues. Every episode that opens in this space is a flame lit in the dark. A flame that the fear of centuries could not extinguish, and that exists only because there are eyes willing to look upon it without retreating. Write in the comments what the silence told you today. Sometimes that is where the most difficult truth makes itself known. Not in the words of the script, but in what the script awakens in those who listen. And in the next episode, Another chamber will open. Another secret that time buried beneath layers of devotion and silence will be waiting. Older, denser, and even closer to that territory where faith and the abyss touch each other. The key is already in the lock. All you have to do is keep going.